Today, October 23, a strategic structure that Moscow had long considered untouchable ceased to exist. Within hours, a key section of the so-called land bridge connecting Russia to occupied Crimea was effectively severed. Satellite images, intercepted communications, and panic-stricken civilian footage point to a series of coordinated strikes, executed with surgical precision. What looked like isolated explosions in the morning quickly escalated into a full-blown disruption of logistics, with at least 3 critical rail segments rendered inoperable. The Kerch ferry lines remain technically functional, but traffic is paralyzed by sheer volume and fear. By mid-morning, traffic congestion on the Tavrida highway stretched for dozens of kilometers, while Russian authorities issued vague reassurances that the situation is under control. But in reality, the situation was far from stable. Military analysts had long warned of this possibility, but few believed it would unfold so quickly and so decisively. The question is no longer whether Crimea can be held, but how fast it can be evacuated. According to sources familiar with the operations, Ukraine's actions were not spontaneous. The attacks came hours after the Security Service of Ukraine hinted at an asymmetric response to recent Russian escalations in the Kherson direction. Evidently, the decision was made to strike not where Russian forces were strongest, but where their sense of safety had become a liability. What happened in the early hours of the day was not a single operation, but a synchronized dismantling of the physical connection that Russia has spent a decade fortifying. In expert circles, the mood is unusually cautious. No one is speaking openly, but the scale of the retreat speaks volumes. Entire columns of vehicles, both military and civilian, are now trying to exit the peninsula. Witnesses report that checkpoints near Armyansk and Chang'ar are overwhelmed, with lines stretching deep into the steppe. Russian soldiers, many of whom were deployed to Crimea just weeks ago, are now being pulled back without explanation. The shift is so sudden that even loyalist channels have begun sharing maps showing alternate evacuation routes. It's a language of panic wrapped in bureaucratic calm. And yet, even now, the full extent of the damage remains unclear. The Russian Ministry of Defense has avoided specifics, offering only pre-recorded statements about planned repairs and logistical regrouping. But the signs are impossible to ignore. Fuel shortages are already being reported in Simferopol. Flights out of Sevastopol are indefinitely delayed. Naval units in the Black Sea appear to be repositioning, not for an attack, but for extraction. Something far deeper is unraveling. And this is only the beginning. If you're watching this and haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. What's happening in Crimea is not an isolated event, it's a signal. And the consequences will ripple far beyond the peninsula. The collapse of the land corridor was not merely a tactical victory, it was a symbolic rupture in Russia's narrative of permanence. For over a year, the so-called Crimea land bridge had served as the central artery for resupplying troops, transporting fuel, and maintaining the illusion of unshakable control. Its destruction exposes not just a logistical vulnerability, but a psychological one. In Moscow, officials continue to insist on stability. Yet, behind closed doors, contingency planning has taken on an entirely new tone. According to sources close to the Russian Security Council, emergency scenarios for partial withdrawal are being reviewed for the first time since 2014. The tone of recent classified discussions, we're told, is no longer one of confidence, but of calculation. The mechanism of the attack has also stunned observers with its precision. Contrary to expectations, this was not a massed assault of drones or a swarm of long-range missiles. Ukrainian forces reportedly used a layered combination of decoys, electronic interference, and precision-guided weapons. In at least 2 instances, radar coverage was deliberately jammed for under 90 seconds, just enough to allow a guided munition to reach its target undetected. Independent analysts reviewing thermal imagery have noted multiple near-simultaneous impacts along the railway between Zankoy and Vladislavivka, a stretch long considered too deep in Russian-controlled territory to be realistically targeted. That assumption no longer holds. But the most revealing detail isn't what was destroyed, it's how Russian forces reacted. Within minutes of the first hit, automated systems flagged mass movements across internal military communication channels. Emergency protocols were activated not just in Crimea, but across southern military districts. Strategic bombers were reportedly pulled from forward positions in Engels and Mozdok. The Black Sea Fleet, once the pride of Russian regional power projection, shifted from operational readiness to silent alert mode. Several warships changed course mid-route and returned to port under radio silence. The coordination and timing suggest that Moscow feared a broader campaign, something larger than just infrastructure sabotage. Civilians, too, have started voting with their feet. In Sevastopol, hundreds of families with ties to the Russian administration have begun leaving in convoys under military escort. Social media posts, though heavily monitored and censored, still leak through. One widely shared video shows dozens of luxury SUVs lined up outside the city's administrative buildings, packed with hastily loaded bags, fuel containers, and satellite phones. The mood among those departing is one of quiet urgency, not yet chaos, but the line is thinning. Local telegram channels, previously brimming with patriotic slogans, now focus on practical advice: which roads remain open, where fuel can still be found, and how to avoid checkpoints experiencing delays of more than 6 hours. However, what's happening is not only a withdrawal, it's a reshaping of strategy. Ukrainian spokespeople have avoided triumphalism, carefully framing the operation as a recalibration of the battlefield. Behind this phrasing lies a deeper intent. Ukrainian forces no longer aim merely to harass Russian positions in Crimea. They are testing the very viability of Russia's ability to defend the peninsula under sustained pressure. And in doing so, they are turning Moscow's greatest asset into a strategic liability. The presence of 35,000 to 40,000 Russian troops in Crimea now presents a logistical burden, not a strength. Every soldier still stationed there requires resupply through corridors that no longer function. Military insiders are now openly debating what they previously only hinted at: is the Russian command preparing for a controlled drawdown from Crimea? So far, there's no public signal to that effect. But subtle moves suggest recalibration. The reallocation of air defense systems from western Crimea toward the Kerch region, the sudden drop in offensive operations in southern Zaporizhia, the rapid deployment of mobile bridging equipment toward the Kherson axis, all point to a shift in posture. Russia is not reinforcing Crimea. It is preparing fallback positions. And this, in itself, changes the dynamic of the war. Yet the most unnerving developments are not on the battlefield, but in the information sphere. Over the last 24 hours, pro-Russian media outlets have gone quiet on Crimea. Regular updates from the peninsula, once featured prominently in state broadcasts, are conspicuously absent. Even the main news bulletins on Rossiya 1 and Channel 1, which have long trumpeted the Fortress Crimea narrative, have shifted focus to diplomatic meetings, economic forums, and unrelated international affairs. This silence speaks louder than any official announcement. In media trained to follow the Kremlin's cues, omission is a signal of retreat. By midday, the Kremlin spokesman issued a short statement claiming that transportation flows are being redirected and temporary delays are being addressed. No mention was made of the strikes. No word on the convoys fleeing south. No reference to the satellite footage that has now gone viral across military analysis communities in the West. Just a vague reaffirmation that Crimea remains secure. But the maps tell a different story. And the people inside Crimea are already acting as if they know it. The next hours may prove decisive. But it's already clear that something fundamental has shifted, not just in geography, but in the strategic imagination of both sides. And while officials in Moscow weigh their next steps, the peninsula itself is already changing hands, not in flags or speeches, but in who controls movement, fear, and time. But the real rupture began not on the railway tracks or highway junctions, it began in the minds of those who believed the peninsula was untouchable. What unfolded throughout the day in Crimea was less a battle, more a psychological unraveling. Residents who for years lived under the shadow of occupation, adapting to the normalization of checkpoints, Russian flags, and military parades, now find themselves in a vacuum of authority. Municipal buildings are operating in a state of semi-desertion. Schools remain open, but attendance has plummeted. Russian administrative staff, according to several local sources, have received informal instructions to limit public visibility. No one is officially calling this an evacuation. But it looks like one, it moves like one, and it has already taken a toll on the public mood. For many Crimeans, the moment of clarity came not with the sound of explosions, but with silence. Silence on state television. Silence from the local authorities. No explanations, no roadmaps, no promises of swift repair. Only the sight of empty shelves in grocery stores and ATM lines stretching out into the street. Fuel is becoming a currency of its own. Black market exchanges have reportedly spiked in Simferopol and Yalta, with cash offers for diesel exceeding 400 rubles per liter, if it can be found at all. Internet access is becoming intermittent, especially near key military installations, as authorities attempt to suppress real-time footage and communication. But fragments still leak through. A burned-out convoy near Bachysary, a railway overpass collapsed outside Krasnoperkovsk, the quiet closure of certain coastal military zones with red tape and plainclothes guards. This is the landscape in which Ukrainian strategic thinking has shifted. Rather than fight for terrain meter by meter, the new approach appears aimed at unmaking Crimea from within, logistically, politically, and emotionally. The attacks are less about explosion and more about isolation. Satellite analysis confirms that the disruption in transport is not limited to physical damage. Electromagnetic interference has been used in select areas to disable guidance systems and communications. Drones, too, are no longer just tools of surveillance or direct attack. Over the course of the day, at least 9 separate drone incursions were recorded over critical air defense sites, not to strike, but to bait Russian operators into revealing radar locations and fire control patterns. These micro-movements point to something broader, a playbook built around systematic degradation, not blitzkrieg. And then there's the element of information warfare. Ukrainian officials have remained almost entirely silent throughout the day, offering only cryptic confirmations. But in that silence lies strategic depth. Western intelligence channels have picked up increases in encrypted Ukrainian military traffic, suggesting ongoing operations are being coordinated under conditions of strict secrecy. Meanwhile, Russian military bloggers, usually quick to share every detail, have become hesitant, their posts peppered with vague language and subdued urgency. One of the most prominent pro-Russian Telegram channels published a single sentence before disappearing from the platform altogether: Crimea is no longer behind the front lines. That sentence has echoed across the Russian defense establishment like a breach alarm. For years, Crimea was the showcase of control, the one region where Russia could stage parades, test naval missiles, and present an image of permanence. That image has now cracked. More importantly, it cracked without the fanfare of a full-scale offensive. The power of Ukraine's approach lies in its patience, its precision, and its refusal to match Russian propaganda with equal noise. While Moscow continued to declare business as usual, events on the ground unfolded with an eerie quiet that made their implications all the more dramatic. In this vacuum, rumors spread faster than facts. Unconfirmed reports suggest that senior Russian military officials have quietly relocated their families from Crimea to the Krasnodar region. Emergency meetings in Moscow, according to 2 independent sources with access to inner defense circles, have focused not just on how to repair the damage, but how to prevent further psychological collapse among stationed forces. Commanders are reportedly facing difficulties maintaining discipline, especially among newly conscripted units. Several instances of internal desertion have been reported in the logistics brigades, though these have not been officially acknowledged. The Russian military machine remains intact, but its coherence is starting to fray at the edges. All of this places extraordinary pressure on decision-makers in the Kremlin. The stakes are no longer confined to the tactical. The loss of Crimea, even symbolically, would represent the collapse of the most cherished narrative of the Putin era, that of the return of Russian greatness. Every missile strike, every intercepted convoy, every fleeing official erodes that illusion further. And yet, Russia cannot afford to overreact militarily in a way that might expose its thinning arsenal or provoke internal backlash. What is unfolding, then, is not just a military predicament. It is an existential one. And here lies the most paradoxical aspect of the day. For all the visible movement, the convoys, the roadblocks, the closures, the core of Russia's Crimea dilemma is now motionless. No reinforcements are coming. No bold announcements are being made. Only cautious maneuvers, vague statements, and the sound of retreat, not with boots, but with silence. And just beyond that silence, Ukraine waits, watching, calculating, and setting the terms for what comes next. If you've been following this closely, you already understand the stakes. But if you're new here, consider subscribing. Because what's happening now isn't just about Crimea, it's about the unraveling of a much larger geopolitical order. And it's only just beginning. By the afternoon hours of October 23, the scale of disintegration had become impossible to disguise, even within Russia's tightly controlled information ecosystem. Unofficial reports began surfacing from medical units stationed in Crimea, describing an unexpected surge in unmarked evacuations, wounded servicemen arriving without documentation, often unconscious, transferred rapidly through temporary triage points before being flown out under guarded secrecy. There was no official announcement of casualties, yet military hospitals in Novorossiysk and Rostov-on-Don quietly shifted to high alert. In private conversations, medical personnel admitted they had been instructed to prepare for extended inflow, though no large battles had been publicly acknowledged. This contradiction raised a critical question: what else is happening in Crimea that hasn't yet surfaced? At the same time, signs of internal fragmentation began to appear across the peninsula. Multiple reports indicate that regional security units, once unified under centralized Russian command, have begun operating with varying degrees of autonomy. Checkpoints that were once manned by military police are now guarded by hastily assembled internal troops and local militia, many lacking proper identification or coordination. In some areas, even these forces have withdrawn, leaving stretches of roadway and key logistical routes unsupervised. The absence of visible authority is breeding uncertainty. Commercial transporters, local merchants, and municipal workers have started avoiding travel between urban centers, citing unpredictable conditions and a growing fear of sudden isolation. But the most telling indicator lies in Moscow's own defensive posture. Satellite images analyzed in real time have revealed a striking development. Mobile air defense units previously stationed in Belgorod and near Voronezh are being redeployed southward, toward the Azov coastline. That decision comes at a cost. These assets were originally positioned to counter potential NATO surveillance and drone activity along the western border. Their relocation is not just logistical, it is symbolic. It signals a shift in threat perception. The Kremlin is no longer treating Crimea as a fortified rear. It is being treated as a collapsing frontline. This shift has also exposed deepening fractures within the Russian military establishment. According to our sources familiar with recent internal briefings, senior officers are divided over how to respond. One faction argues for aggressive re-escalation, massive retaliation, full mobilization, the use of long-range systems to suppress Ukraine's cross-Dnipro capabilities. But another faction, more technocratic in nature, warns that such moves would expose systemic vulnerabilities, especially with ammunition stocks already stretched and production lines operating under sanctions-induced constraints. This internal divide has led to paralysis. As of midday, no counteroffensive has been announced. No new reinforcements have crossed the Kerch Strait. Instead, Moscow has issued a muted call for administrative reorganization of transit priorities, a phrase so devoid of substance that even pro-government outlets are struggling to contextualize it. Meanwhile, the effects of Ukrainian pressure continue to intensify. Late in the day, new footage began circulating of suspected sabotage operations inside Crimea. A major communications relay tower near Sakhay suffered an unexplained failure, cutting off military bandwidth access for several key command outposts. Though the Russian Ministry of Communications cited technical issues, military observers suspect a coordinated electronic warfare strike. Separately, in the hills near Alushta, multiple fire teams were seen mobilizing rapidly before disappearing into wooded terrain, an unusual pattern that suggests the possible insertion of reconnaissance or special forces teams. The idea of Ukrainian units operating behind Russian lines in Crimea would have been dismissed as unthinkable just weeks ago. Now, it is openly discussed in military briefings. And yet, the most destabilizing blow may not have come from missile or drone, but from trust. In conversations intercepted from open communication bands, panic is creeping into Russian unit leadership. Soldiers have begun questioning orders, doubting the reliability of supply chains, even refusing to patrol outside of secured zones after sunset. Morale, always fragile in contested territories, is beginning to degrade in visible ways. One intercepted radio message, translated by independent monitors, captured a chilling admission: "We're not even sure who's in control anymore." That sentiment, echoed in dozens of messages and social media posts, reveals a disintegration not just of command, but of cohesion. Ukrainian officials, for their part, continue to say little. But through their actions, a doctrine is taking shape: degrade, isolate, paralyze. The goal is not to retake Crimea in one sweeping operation, but to make it untenable for Russian forces to stay. And as the day progresses, that goal seems increasingly within reach. Each destroyed junction, each failed relay, each closed checkpoint becomes part of a broader narrative, one of systematic unmaking. Even Russia's political class seems uncertain of how to respond. In the State Duma, emergency sessions have reportedly shifted focus from legislation to crisis containment. Governors from southern Russian regions have requested additional funds to prepare for potential spillover, an indirect admission that the fighting may soon cross unofficial boundaries. Prominent propagandists, once eager to speak of Crimea as the jewel of Russian history, now tiptoe around the topic altogether. The absence is telling. For a regime that relies on narrative as much as on force, the loss of a storyline can be as dangerous as the loss of territory. But the most surreal moment came closer to evening. In a televised address marking an unrelated anniversary, President Putin made no mention of Crimea. Not a word. No reassurances, no condemnation, no statement of resolve. For millions watching, the omission was louder than any declaration. And across the peninsula, it was felt like a chill. Not because anything was said, but because nothing was. At this point, the question is not whether Ukraine has pierced the illusion of control. It's how far that rupture will travel before the weight of silence collapses into action. And judging by the tremors now shaking Russia's grip on the peninsula, that collapse may come sooner than many expected. By the late afternoon of October 23, the atmosphere in Crimea had shifted from controlled anxiety to quiet dread. The day, which began with explosions and logistical chaos, was now drawing to a close under a sky eerily free of aircraft, with Russian air patrols significantly reduced and air defense radars operating in irregular cycles. Locals who had grown used to the constant hum of military aviation reported an unusual stillness, an absence that felt less like safety and more like abandonment. At the Sevastopol naval base, ship activity fell sharply. Several smaller vessels were observed leaving port with no official communication or return trajectory. The suggestion was clear: select assets were being pulled not for repositioning, but for preservation. In expert discussions held behind closed doors, this withdrawal is already being described in more strategic terms. Crimea, long treated as a crown jewel, is now a liability Russia can no longer afford to secure with confidence. The implications are profound. For years, Moscow presented the peninsula not only as a symbol of geopolitical resurgence, but as a line that would never be crossed. That line is now blurred. Ukraine has not merely crossed it, it has begun erasing it. And perhaps most notably, it has done so without declaring a formal offensive, without a single televised address, without even confirming its intent. That ambiguity is part of the power. By refusing to frame the operation as a grand assault, Ukraine has denied Russia the traditional framework of escalation. Every strike, every disruption is framed as tactical, local, proportional. Yet their cumulative effect is anything but. Russia finds itself reacting to events it cannot anticipate, defending assets that are no longer strategically defensible. For every bridge repaired, another line of retreat appears. For every convoy rerouted, a new threat emerges. The battlefield has become a psychological mirror, reflecting confusion, fatigue, and the slow erosion of narrative control. And in that mirror, a more dangerous truth begins to form. Crimea was never just about geography. It was about permanence, about the illusion that one side could decide history unilaterally and indefinitely. But permanence, it turns out, is vulnerable to erosion. Not in one dramatic blow, but in steady, relentless pressure. The kind that wears down not just logistics, but belief. Today, across the peninsula, that belief is fraying. Russian officers speak in half-sentences. Military families call relatives on the mainland, asking whether evacuation is possible in case the situation changes. And within the cities, a strange quiet spreads, not the calm of control, but the pause before movement. International observers are already recalibrating their assessments. Western intelligence agencies, who once treated Crimea as a frozen theater, now speak in terms of fluid fronts. Satellite data shows defensive belts being hastily constructed along the northern access roads to Simferopol and Bakhchisarai, suggesting that Russian planners are preparing for the unthinkable, urban resistance inside what was supposed to be permanent territory. Meanwhile, reports indicate that Ukrainian special units are expanding their reconnaissance footprint deeper into the southern ridge, identifying new choke points and soft targets. The scale is still limited, but the message is clear. Crimea is not secure. It is exposed. And yet, there is no celebration in Kiev. Ukrainian officials maintain the same deliberate silence that has defined this entire operation. No triumphant declarations, no images of raised flags, no rhetoric of victory. The goal is not public spectacle, it is attrition by design. By avoiding escalation theatrics, Ukraine denies Moscow the emotional fuel it once used to rally support. This is not just a war of weapons. It is a contest of timelines. And Ukraine appears willing to extend the clock for as long as necessary, forcing Russia to spend resources defending a position that may already be lost in practice, if not yet in name. Inside Russia, the reaction remains fractured. Among nationalist circles, frustration is mounting. Prominent voices are beginning to question not Ukraine's capabilities, but the Kremlin's silence. Why, they ask, are there no decisive actions? Why are troops left without reinforcement? Why is Crimea being allowed to hang in the wind? The absence of answers is creating a vacuum. And into that vacuum seeps doubt, not about Ukraine, but about Moscow's ability to respond with the decisiveness that once defined its regional posture. Meanwhile, on the ground in Crimea, the civilian exodus accelerates. Traffic congestion out of the peninsula has reached levels not seen since the early days of 2022. Ferry terminals in Kerch are overwhelmed, with wait times stretching into double-digit hours. Makeshift camps have begun appearing along exit routes, housing those unable to leave or unsure where to go. For now, Russian forces are trying to maintain order. But the more civilians flee, the harder it becomes to manage even basic logistical operations. And in this kind of environment, disorder feeds itself. In the broader geopolitical frame, the unraveling of Russia's hold on Crimea sends a message that echoes far beyond the Black Sea. It is a reminder that no occupation, no matter how entrenched, can survive when the occupying force begins to doubt its own permanence. That message will be read in Transnistria, in Abkhazia, in South Ossetia. It will be studied in Beijing, in Tehran, and in Washington. Because what is happening now in Crimea is not merely a battlefield shift, it is the exposure of an idea long treated as immutable. And so, as the day draws to a close, the landscape of Crimea has changed, not yet in flags or frontlines, but in mood, in movement, and in the quiet calculus of those who once claimed control. The peninsula may still be under Russian command. But command without confidence is a hollow shell. What we're witnessing now is not just a retreat, it is a reckoning. And if you've followed this far, it's because you sense that what's happening in these hours could mark the beginning of a far greater unraveling. Stay with us. Because the next silence may speak even louder than today's collapse.